looking pretty bleak.
Do you buy that we're bottoming out now, as Chamath is sort of hypothesizing?
I mean, I'll tell you, I was running some back of the envelope math. You know how much debt there is in the world? Take a guess.
200, couple hundred trillion. 200 trillion.
About 300 trillion.
Yeah.
That's debt owed by governments, businesses, and households. And if in response to the inflation, which is response to fiscal stimulus, which is a response to the entire economy of the world shutting down for a couple of months, we end up raising rates from 0 to 5%. That's $15 trillion of annual debt service, which is like 18% of global GDP. Like that, the debt service alone.
But what does that mean?
18%. That means that for every dollar transacted,
no, it means nothing.
To tax it. No, it means you have to.
What does it mean? Like, so what?
So I'm saying that there's a massive squeeze that's going to happen, right? And so what ends up happening ultimately is, because you could run this across local governments.
I think it means demand destruction. I mean,
sovereign debt, households. Yeah,
I don't think it means.
I'll tell you, Chamath, what it means.
I'm sorry to talk your bubble, but it means nothing, and I'll tell you why. These people keep
because you can print more money.
You print more money. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but like it is not as if we have a law, a constitutional law, or it's not as if governments have collectively decided that you cannot have debt to GDP above a certain number. That doesn't happen, guys. We passed 100 under Obama, and we've just kept printing money. So whether we like it or not, and I'm not saying I'm a fan of this or it's right, we are kicking the can down the road. And what we're doing is we're extending the maturities. You know, you'll eventually have 100-year government bonds, okay? Just like you have like now, you know, multi-decade long corporate bonds.
We missed a chance for that. We missed it. Because brilliant Yellen actually said no to that. When rates were like near zero and we had the opportunity to refinance the U.S. government debt using long-term rates, basically long-term bonds. And actually it was Trump who, you know, crazy Trump who suggested let's basically shift the debt to 100-year bonds. And she said no.
She thought it would devalue the dollar, right?
So the problem is that we have all this short-term debt. And look at what just happened in the UK when Liz Truss tried to prop up the bond rates by basically intervening. It was basically an inflationary policy to fight inflation. The markets puked all over that, and that's when the pound hit, you know,
exactly
new lows.
There's only you have to have a buyer of the debt, right?
I think the Liz Truss thing is really actually a microcosm of how, unfortunately, Western governments are working. But I think there's a silver lining. Like, she basically came in a day after she got elected and said, okay, guess what, guys? At the same time, I'm going to massively cut taxes and I'm going to give you fiscal stimulus. I'm going to cap your energy bills and I'm going to have these huge transfer payments from the government into the hands of British citizens. I'm not going to comment on whether that's right or wrong. But the financial markets, to your point, David, absolutely hated it. And within a few days, you basically saw the pound get crushed. But then what did you see? You saw the Bank of England decide that financial stability was more important than financial viability, meaning the things that she wanted to do were not viable. So you could have let the financial markets sort this out, which would have forced the prime minister to basically abandon the policy. But instead, the BOE said, no, we're an unlimited buyer of UK gilts, which is the name of the UK bond. And everything snapped back. We're back to where we were before her speech and before the Chancellor of the Exchequer's speech. And so it's as if nothing happened. And that's what's so insane to me, which is that even though the Bank of England, by the way, in the next week or two are going to raise rates 140 basis points, 140 basis points, almost double what the Fed has done the last 3 times. They're doing both at the same time. They're both raising rates and they're acting as a backstop for bad policy. And this is what's wrong right now in the world. We do not have a real check and balance. And so my point to Friedberg is just that I'm like emotionally on your side. But the problem is, if these folks keep getting bailed out, David, they're just going to keep doing this stuff, and there's no end in sight.
Well, the consumer doesn't get bailed out. So that if you look at it on a micro basis instead of a macro basis, you're correct. These governments will just bail people out, even if they make bad decisions, as we're seeing. But then the person whose variable interest mortgage just kicked in has $500 less a month in savings. So they're now not going to buy an iPhone 14. They're not going to upgrade their car every 6 years. They're going to do it every 8 years. So the demand destruction that's happening is going to be quite severe, and that's going to reduce monetary velocity, and then we restart.
Mark my words, the Federal Reserve will intervene. This is why I think we're in a bottoming process. I think the bleeding edge of the smart financial actors are actually on Sachs's side and Friedberg's side, but then they're taking that next intellectual leap and saying, okay, well, what happens when Apple basically says, hey guys, I'm going to have to fire 15% of my employees? I think what happens is the Fed intervenes. And I'm just using Apple as an example. But there is a threshold of demand destruction, Jason. I think you're right, where we have the Fed come back on the table and the markets just go bonkers.
So they, instead of doing 75 basis points 2 or 3 times, they're just going to be like, I'll do 50. We'll slow it down.
No. They're gonna get to 4.5 very quickly. And then something's gonna break, like all these guys are saying. I think they're right. And then the Fed comes back on the table, and we'll have this.
Bailouts.
We'll have the UK. The UK thing happened in 6 days? Ours will play out over 6 or 9 months, but it's going to play out the exact same way. And Friedberg's right. We should have capped debt at, 100% of GDP or less. And Sachs is right. We should have issued 100-year bonds at 0 rates when we had the chance. We didn't do either of those things.
Why is the Fed so incompetent, Sachs? I mean, there was no need to have rates this low for that long. And maybe they could just keep them at some average number instead of going down to 0 or then spiking back up and just spinning the steering wheel, so violently. Why don't we have some basic concept of maybe not having 0 rates and keeping them at 2% or something reasonable so you have some dry powder?
Well, if you go back and listen to what the Fed said, and Druck makes this point, they were all worried that there was an inflation print a few years ago where it was at 1.7%, and they all started panicking about not being at 2%. So for a 0.3% move that they tried to engineer, they opened the floodgates. Okay, and that's basically what happened. And that's why he's so critical of it. The other thing is remember the Fed said we're going to be data-driven? But then the data came in last summer. We got that surprise 5.1% print, and they dismissed it as transitory. So they said they're going to be data-driven, but they weren't. They were dismissive. Now, on what basis did they conclude transitory? Like, what was the proof for that? There was no proof. That was a political consideration. The administration and Yellen, this big part of that, immediately reacted to basically downplay the news. I mean, they PR'd it. I mean, they didn't want to admit that there was a problem.
They went from transitory to this is permanent to now.
In 6 months.
And now we're at hard landing. Like, these people are not competent. Are they just not competent?
No, I think they are competent, but I think that they're a little bit fighting with one hand tied behind their back. I think if you had to take the other side, Sachs, the problem is they have a very specific strain of data that they focus on. And that data has all these weird anomalies to it. Like, they should look at rent data. But the way that the rent data works is that, you bleed it in 1/6 a month over 6 months. Just as an odd example, or like used car data only comes in a certain way. So
I think they're driving in the rearview mirror. I think there is something to that.
I think it's simpler than this, which is, listen, I think all politicians do this, which is when they get bad news, they want to spin it. And they're going to delay acknowledging the bad news as long as possible. So what happened? Last summer when this inflation started, they all dismissed it. It was all a talking point. I mean, every single one of them. And here's the crazy thing is Jay Powell, he's the only Trump official who got reappointed by Biden by a huge majority. How do you think that happened? And when did it happen? It happened at the end of May last summer. So just when this inflation print came out and Yellen and the administration were saying it was transitory, that's when Powell was up for renomination. And he swept through the only Trump appointment to basically be renominated without even a question by Biden. Why? Because he got on board the talking points. He wasn't going to basically buck them at that time. So he waited 6 months. He bought into the talking points. That was 100% political. 100%.
I told you, I read Paul.
It's a very compelling argument.
I read
It's really compelling. It's sad, but compelling.
Sachs, you should read the Paul Volcker book, Keeping at It. He basically says Reagan came to him off-site where they knew they wouldn't be recorded and told him, do not raise rates. So this idea that the Fed is independent, like history now has shown us it is not. Like there is massive political pressure on them. I think
especially at the time,
they're driving in the rearview mirror. Clearly, the data they have is not great, and then all this data is nuanced. Jobs and this massive amount of jobs we've had in this country is because of we have a new immigration policy. We don't let people into this country. We kick out PhDs that we trained, and then housing. We have iBuyers buying this. So to your point, Chamath, I think a lot of the data has changed, and they've got a bad data set. They have a bad dashboard, and they're driving with bad information. They don't know their direction. They don't know their speed perfectly. They need more fidelity on the data.
You're right. If you went to a board of directors meeting for your company and said, how's the business doing? And the CEO says, we're going to have data from 6 months ago. And it's like, okay, I got that. But what about like last week? You would fire that CEO, to your point, Jason. And these things are knowable today. Like there are businesses, for example, that are selling billions of dollars worth of like IoT sensors here and there, energy sensors here. Everything is connected to the internet. Everything is automated. Everything is running in code. You would think that the government would say there's a national level directive here to get this into some kind of a system that we can use because these decisions are becoming more and more important. I think that would be a wonderful idea and a project, and it would have huge value.
A Manhattan Project for understanding the economy on a very granular level. You invested in a startup at one point. I remember I heard the pitch where they had people around the world taking pictures of food prices, Africa, India, the United States, anywhere, and then putting them into a database, normalizing them so you could know the price of tomatoes or potatoes on a global basis, and normalizing all that data. They don't seem to have this data there. They're talking about August data, and it's we're now in October.
It's a really odd situation.
I think our friend Brad Gerstner made this point, which was that look, in this last FOMC meeting, the Fed raised their forecast for what the neutral interest rate would be from 3.5% to 4.6%. So in 2 months, they raised their forecast by over 100 basis points. What is that based on? Like, is there a model? I assume there is a model. I assume there's data. So why don't they just open source that? Why don't they let the markets see the model they're using so we have a little more predictability? Of course, they always have the discretion to buck it or not follow it or whatever, or change it. But wouldn't that be a better approach, is to let us see the data and the models in real time as it's happening? And then the community, like an open source project, could actually fork the model and actually create better ones.
Well, to your point, there's the Fed is actually known as the gold standard of transparency. So the IMF has kind of a view on how all these central banks act. Last week, they actually excoriated, and this hurts me to say, Canada, because of their lack of transparency. Apparently, Canada doesn't even put out minutes. And so they were like, hey, Canada, you guys look, Canadians are, the Canadian government, at least, total moral virtue signalers, but they don't value transparency, apparently. But to your point, David, there is a lot of opacity in these things that really determine how the real world works, and the impacts to individual people are going to go and get ratcheted way up, and nobody really knows what to expect, even though the data is there sitting in plain sight.
I think two things can be true. I think the Fed, the process of setting central bank rates by the Federal Reserve should be reset. I also think that it could be true that the Fed is not responsible fully for a lot of the conditions we're now facing. We did have a bunch of policy decisions that the whole world got swept up in and seemed to accept as appropriate at the time when we shut the global economy down. And there was some weird assumption or belief that fiscal policy would allow us to soft land or recover out of that. And at the end of the day, all that fiscal policy did, and I remember I was speaking with a smart person at the time, and he said, all the Fed's going to do is they're just going to inflate everything. And it's going to take a while, and everything will inflate, and that way everyone will feel good for a while. But you can't just stop the spigot of capital moving, goods moving, and services moving for months on end and assume that the repercussions will not actually be felt extremely harshly. And at some point, things are going to come home to roost. And that is what's happening. There was no winning solution for the Fed or for any central banker in light of the policy decisions that were made to shut the global economy down. when COVID began. Not to argue whether or not that was appropriate, but that was simply a statement of fact. I said it before, and I don't understand if you were to take a first principles point of view on this today and say, hey, let's create a central bank and how should it operate? You would take all the data from Intuit, from PayPal, from Visa, from MasterCard, from the internet. You would take all of that data. You would let the algorithms or the AI or the software figure out what is most predictive of certain inflationary, recessionary,
Totally.
and growth indicators.
Totally.
And you would basically say, look, X% growth, X% inflation, solve for what the central bank's interest rate should be. And it should vary at a hundredths of a percent or a basis point every day. And every day the rate is reset and the software resets it. And to have, some degree of human logic or oversight seems appropriate, but to have a decision made in 0.25% increments once every couple of weeks seems kind of arcane. So I think both things are true. The Fed isn't necessarily fully responsible. We all want to point fingers. We can point fingers at the mania that swept over the entire world when we started our podcast, and everyone was like, what the hell is going on? Why are we locking down the world? And this is nuts. And it felt nuts. And the response may or may not have been appropriate. But at the end of the day, there was a cost, and the cost is going to be borne for very likely a decade or more if we are able to get through it all.
A lost decade is a possibility.
And central banks should be rewritten. So, yeah.
Well, I think there's actually two original sins of the economic crisis we're in. One is lockdowns. You're right. Like, that was a fiasco. It didn't do anything to stop COVID. It was an economic disaster. And then we overreacted to lockdowns by then printing all of this money, both fiscally and through expansionist monetary policy. So Friedberg's right about that. But I think the other original sin here is the QE and the ZIRP, right? The zero interest rate policy that began in 2008, 2009. We broke the glass in case of emergency.
Totally.
Yeah, and then it just became standard. Like, it was on autopilot. Why did we keep printing? Why did the government keep buying
It was a
bonds?
long tail event that became the meme.
Yeah, but
This is the problem, is that every time government...
ZIRP is a bad idea. I mean, it's just...
Yeah, Milton Friedman once said, there's nothing quite so permanent as a temporary government program. How many times have we seen this? Every time the government's supposed to do something on a one-off emergency basis, like ZIRP, it ends up becoming institutionalized. We still have kids in schools in California wearing masks. I mean, it's the same crazy thing that people cannot get off these programs.
The thing about ZIRP, which if you look back, what really happened, if you think about like how people live their lives every day, what has happened in our view of government and politicians? It's really eroded since 2007, 2008, right? There's huge amounts of rancor. Nobody gets along. Everything tends to happen on partisan lines. And the reason I think that was allowed to happen or that accelerated is actually because of ZIRP. Because if you think about it, if you had failed policy, right, and the economy was completely broken, politicians would actually have to get together and try to solve the problem themselves. And the last time they really did that was actually in the great financial crisis. If you look at TARP, and if you look at how all of these smart people actually had to get together in a bipartisan way to figure out how do we bail out America and prevent a banking crisis, that was the last real effort that touched a lot of people. But then, David, as you said, on the heels of that, we broke the glass, and we've been fighting ever since. And the peak of that fighting was basically Donald Trump getting elected. And so I think like what it shows is that if you have these irrational central bankers that are willing to constantly bail people out, you will never get a high functioning government because policy is irrelevant. Good policy doesn't matter. Bad policy doesn't matter. If any of it goes wrong, the central banker will come in and bail us out.
Well, and the second and third order impact of these can become quite acute. And just for people who heard the word ZIRP like 3 times, zero interest rate policy, basically keeping interest rates very low, very dangerous to do because you get shit like this. Like, look at the number of unemployed people per job opening. And if you just look at this like ratio, this is the number of jobs per unemployed person, it gets way out of whack. And then if you look at this other chart, just in terms of the total number of job openings, we talked about this earlier in the pod, hitting 11 million. To burn that off is crazy. Then what happens if you have too many jobs? You don't let immigration, you don't have a functioning immigration policy. Well, then you get this great, people quitting their jobs, quiet quitting, and then the boomers saw their net worth go up so high because of their retirement accounts, because of the stock market boom, and because of the housing boom. You had all these rich parents now who are bailing out their kids who refuse to go to work, and labor participation goes from 70% down to 62%. These are the unintended consequences of ZIRP. That, now, how do you get a generation to go back to work if their parents have, a $2 million home and $3 million in stocks, or $1 million home, $1 million in stocks?
You have to break the economy. Yeah,
and that's what they're doing. Now they're like, we're going to break this. We're going to get Google and Apple, who have unlimited cash, to do a RIF. Those companies don't need to do a RIF. They're doing it because they have no choice now, because they want to break the economy so hard. Boomers have $71 trillion in assets over March. I mean, the wealth transfer that's going to occur between these two generations is crazy. Why would any
US
Gen
boomers?
X or millennial with a boomer parent even go
US
to work
boomers.
if they've got $1 million?
US boomers have $71 trillion in assets. Is that what you said?
Yeah, that's the number I have here. So
an entire turn of global GDP in savings.
That's about 1/7 of the world's total assets.
it's just a lot of locked up wealth. And this monetary policy was done by boomers.
70 trillion controlled by 76.4 million people.
Yeah.
So if you want to really talk about the rich in a global context, the rich are very specifically US boomers.
Yeah, that's 1/7 of the world's
It's
assets.
1/7 of the world's assets. It's controlled by 76 million people.
How much of it is their homes?
I mean, they were at Woodstock. They lived the best life in the best times. They enjoyed the most of the peace dividend in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. They are the ones that control everything.
It's pretty crazy.
I think it's less like Jeff Bezos and Gates and Musk. It's boomers. That, if you want to go and really zoom out and get it right, it is boomers. It's 1% of the global population that controls 1/7 of the global wealth. And they're all in the United States.
US boomers.
Hiding in plain sight. US boomers. There you are.
Well, once these housing prices decline and the stock market declines, that number is going to shift. And that really is what's fundamentally happening with the fiscal policy and the effects it's having today, which is a redistribution of that value, because we're basically deflating all those assets now. We're going to deflate
the
stock,
average boomer was
financial
worth
assets, and we're going to deflate real estate assets.
I mean, if you just do the math on that, back of the envelope, these boomers are worth $1 million each. Like, think about that. Like, every boomer is worth $900K, $1 million, something in that range.
1.2 million.
I mean, it's bonkers. That's the average. That's how much wealth they have. Bonkers.
You two are a boomer, JK.
No, we're Gen X. We're Gen X. Clearly.
Yeah, we had the worst. We got really shafted. It's like we grew up with flannel.
We had to
Pearl
listen to
Jam.
Alanis Morissette.
No, hold on. She's Canadian, so hold on.
I mean,
She's
Nirvana,
Canadian.
Smashing Pumpkins. I mean, I thought it was
easy.
dope.
I
90s were
agree.
great.
93 was probably the best year ever for music.
Smashing Pumpkins ever did it for me. Billy Corgan's voice was always like, ah!
Yeah,
It was great.
really annoying.
Rage Against the Machine.